Hey, thanks for having me. Um, Thank you to the North Central Regional Library and to you, Amanda, for reaching out, and to Anne, who's been helping. Um, Writers tend to be a solitary bunch, and COVID has just made it worse. So it's good to get out, even if it's on Zoom. And it's always great to connect with readers. That's why we do this. And so I actually really love being here. And I've heard that this is a giant library district that stretches from Canada down almost to Mexico. It sounds big. And it sounds like there's a lot of beautiful country. And my books tend to be about place and usually in wild country. So it's good to speak to people who know about that. I thought what I'd do is, my latest book is The River. I'll hold the cover up. I thought what I'd do is do a little reading from it, probably like 6 minutes total. So sorry if you hate to be read to, but I don't think as adults we get read to enough. And one of my favorite things when I was little, my dad used to read to me almost every night before I went to sleep. And he had me hearing E.E. Cummings when I was like 6, the poet, and which I always think was grounds for social services, because a lot of the poems are pretty bawdy, but I didn't understand them, but I still remember the music of the language in some of the poems, like Buffalo Bill's defunct, who used to ride a silver, water-smooth stallion and break 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pigeons just like that. Jesus, he was a handsome man. And what I want to know is, how do you like your blue-eyed boy, Mr. Death? And just imagine a 6-year-old, I'd be like blinking up at him. I didn't understand the poems, but I thought the music and the language was so cool. And I heard Yeats when I was like 11, and I just loved it. And I also think it's good to hear fiction in the voice of the author, because the way I write, I listen for the lines. And so when I'm reading them now, you get to sort of hear them the way I heard them as I was listening. So I thought I'd start right at the prologue, the first page of the book, and save you guys some time if you haven't read the book. And like I said, it'll just be for a few minutes. So, The River, prologue. They had been smelling smoke for 2 days. At first, they thought it was another campfire, and that surprised them because they had not heard the engine of a plane, and they'd been traveling the string of long lakes for days and had not seen sign of another person or even the distant movement of another canoe. The only tracks in the mud of the portages were wolf and moose, otter, bear. The winds were west and north, and they were moving north, so if it was another party, they were ahead of them. It perplexed them because they were smelling smoke not only in early morning and at night, but would catch themselves at odd hours, lifting their noses like coyotes, nostrils flaring. And then one evening they pulled up on a wooded island and they made camp and fried a meal of lake trout on a driftwood fire and watched the sun sink into the spruce on the far shore. Late August, a clear night becoming cold. There was no aurora borealis, just the dense sparks of the stars blown from their own ancient fire. They climbed the hill. They did not need a headlamp as they were used to moving in the dark. Sometimes if they were feeling strong, they paddled half the night. They loved how the darkness amplified the sounds, the gulp of the dipping paddles, the knock of the wood shaft against the gunwale, the long, desolate cry of a loon. The loons especially, how they hollowed out the night with longing. Tonight there was no loon and almost no wind, and they went up through tamarack and hemlock and a few large birch trees whose pale bark fluoresced. At the top of the knoll, they followed a game trail to a ledge of broken rock as if they weren't the first who had sought the view. And they saw it. They looked northwest. At first they thought it was the sun, but it was far too late for any lingering sunset, and there were no cities in that direction for 1,000 miles. In the farthest distance, over the trees, was an orange glow. It lay on the horizon like the light from banked embers, and it fluttered barely, so they wondered if it were their eyes, and they knew it was a fire. A forest fire, who knew how far off or how big, but bigger than any they could imagine. It seemed to spread over 2 quadrants, and they didn't say a word, but the silence of it and the way it seemed to breathe scared them to the bone. The prevailing wind would push the blaze right to them. At the pace they were going, they were at least 2 weeks from the Cree village of Wapak and Hudson Bay. When the most northerly lake spilled into the river, they would pick up speed, but there was no way to shorten the miles. So we got 2 buddies. They're best friends from college. They met on the first day, and they're very different. Jack is a ranch kid from Western Colorado. He spent half his life in the saddle, making breakfast over an open fire and sleeping under the stars are kind of second nature to the kid, as natural as breathing. And he's tough, you know, the way those guys are. He's, you know, rain and cold and hunger and all of that are neither really good nor bad. I mean, it's just something you do. And he's wary. He suffered a tragedy when he was like 11, and I won't spoil it, but it was about as bad as it can get, and it made him sort of wary of people, and he kind of retreated into books. He was a voracious reader, and into fishing, and you know, riding his horse Duke. And his best friend Win is really different. He's 6'5". Jack is kind of compact. Win is like this gentle giant. He's an architect's son from Vermont, and he loves nothing more than to make ephemeral art out of sticks and rocks and feathers like Goldsworthy. He's an arts major, and he's really gentle, and he kind of expects the best of everybody. He's kind of like a black lab, like that. So these 2 guys decide that they're going to blow half the money that they earned as guides over the summer, the last month of this summer, on a flight into a lake, and they're going to paddle this river that flows in 250 miles into Hudson Bay, way up in Ontario. And stuff happens. A lot of stuff. So I'm going to just read this one other section. I barely ever read this. I love reading this section. So it's like 3 minutes. Here we go. They're camped now. Lots of stuff has happened. Jack is sort of standing guard in this camp. He's sort of a sentry for the next bunch of hours. Now he blew out a long breath and shivered and zipped himself up. He stretched and looked up at the sky. Across the river and downstream, high up, somewhere over where the fire should be, there was a pale cloud that drifted and elongated and accordioned into a high curtain of softest light. And as he watched, it spread slowly across the northern sky. It pulsed with inner radiance as if alive, and then poured itself like a cascade to the horizon and shimmered with green. A pale green cataract of something scintillant that spread across an entire quadrant and sang as it fell with total absence of sound, of substance, of water or air. In the weeks before, they had sometimes seen what looked like the faintest moving clouds, but not this. Now an arc of greener light shot from the top of the falls and jumped the current of the Milky Way and ignited a swirl of pink in the southeast that humped and crested like a wave. Jack shivered. The northern lights had just enacted what the heat and sparks would do when they jumped the river. It was like a portent, more a preview. And it was as if every cantlet and breath of the night was filled with song and silence. It was terrifying and unutterably beautiful. When it told him that the Cree and other northern peoples thought of the lights as the spirits of the dead who looked down in judgment of the living, and so when the aurora appeared, the people kept their bad children inside so as not to offend the ancestors. Jack thought that was funny. He figured a bad child, or adult for that matter, was just as bad inside as out, and that if the ancestors could pull off a show like this, then they probably had like thermal sensors or something that could image the bad kids hiding in the igloo or tent or cabin. which made him think of the man Pierre. He was bad. He had tried to kill them in all earnestness twice now. Those ancestors up there, they knew. They were looking down on the man tonight too. Jack had no doubt. And if they wanted to enact punishment, and if Jack was the instrument of their vengeance, he was glad to oblige. Hell with Pierre. He would put a bullet in him in happy reciprocity, and if he didn't kill the man, he'd be happy to truss him up like a calf at branding and tow him down the river on a log raft awash with waves. Jack shrugged the rifle off his shoulder and took it in both hands and surveyed the camp. The fire, a nexus of vulnerability, a target as conspicuous as a bullseye. The woman sleeping there. In off-ways in the shifting light of the flames, the blue tent. At least it wasn't yellow. Wind inside it. He knew his buddy. He'd be sleeping like the dead. Scratch that, bite your tongue. Like a log, like an angel. Jack felt himself smile. Wynn was an angel in a way. He slept usually as soon as his head hit the pillow or rolled up jacket. He slept easily and hard because Jack figured his conscience was clear and he had faith in the essential goodness of the universe and so felt cradled by it. Imagine, that's what Jack thought. Imagine feeling that way, like God held you in the palm of his hand or whatever. Wynn could take all the philosophy courses he wanted, and he had taken a few, and he could read the arguments of Kant, the treatises of Schopenhauer, and he did. But in the end, though he did not think of himself as religious in the least, Wynn would bet all his chips on goodness. It wasn't even a bet, was it? It was no decision at all. Like the fish who had no idea what water was. Wynn swam in it. The universe cradled him. It cradled all beings. Everything would work out. Being suffered, that sucked. He himself suffered. It certainly sucked. But step back far enough and take the long view and everything would take care of itself. It's sort of odd, Jack. Sometimes, usually, it made him crazy. Phew, end of reading. You guys don't have to listen to me drone on.
Oh, beautiful. We love it. So Peter, The River was hands down my favorite book last summer. I devoured it on a road trip and totally ignored my family. Couldn't put it down. But for our attendees who may not be as familiar with the story, could you tell us more about what it's about?
Yeah, so it's these two friends, and they're both consummate outdoorsmen, even though they're so different. They're, as I said, they're both voracious readers. They all read every Louis L'Amour book ever written, all 120 of them. And they're really happy to know that each other are, they've never met another kid who was so good in the outdoors who loved books as much as, they did. And they were so happy to find that the other wasn't a literary snob. That they loved Louis L'Amour. They loved a yarn that could run headlong, and just be fun. And so they had all that stuff in common, fishing, paddling, just being outside, and books. And they just, as I said, they decided to take this trip. And what they decided to do is not take a sat phone and not even take watches. They want to just they have never had time. They've always worked. They've always, crammed their outdoor trips into little, days at a time. And this is the first time they have a month. And so they don't even plan a date for the plane to pick them up at Hudson Bay. The river runs north into Hudson Bay and follows the track of a real river. I changed the name. And they figured they're just going to immerse themselves, in the rhythms of, the days and nights. And they go in mid-August because they think that it's least likely to get, early onset of cold fall, mid-August to mid-September. They've heard about expeditions that went in September, got overrun by early winter, and people died. And so anyway, they head out. And, the first thing they do is encounter a big fire, and then they encounter all sorts of other stuff. And I won't give it away, but it's a page turner for sure.
Absolutely. So I am so interested in knowing how you wrote The River. What is the origin story of this book?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I always start with the first line. I never have an idea. and I don't plot, and I don't outline. I wrote, when I got out of school, I had to make a living, and I wanted to be a fiction writer. And I'm going to tell this story because, so I'll backtrack a little bit away from the river, but maybe a lot. How I got the idea of writing fiction. When I was 11, I was walking around my little library, and I'm going to tell this story because this is a library reading, and I love librarians. I was walking around my little library in Brooklyn, New York, which is where I grew up, and it was a little school. And I had a crush on the librarian. Her name was Annie Bosworth, and she was English. And like I said, I was 11, and I would have married her that day just for the way she said my name. She said, Peter, like that. And she goes, are you looking for something to read? And I was like, thump, thump. She, like all great librarians and booksellers who's kind of followed your reading since you were just tiny, which she had, knew what I was ready for. And she went over to the fiction shelf and she pulled off this slim little volume of stories called In Our Time by Ernest Hemingway. And they're mostly stories about Nick Adams way up in Upper Michigan in the woods. And you got to picture a kid who's 11 bringing this home in the middle of New York City. My heart just leapt out of my chest. I was like, I want to do that. I want to hop off a slow moving freight train in the woods of Upper Michigan with a rucksack and hike through grass that wet my pant legs with dew and make camp by the Big Two-Hearted River. I wanted to make cowboy coffee like Nick did. And I didn't know what that was, but it sounded awesome. And I wanted to catch those gorgeous trout the way Nick caught them. I wanted to, like in the end of something, that beautiful breakup story, I wanted to have a girlfriend that could row and fish like a man. How cool is that? And then break up with her because Nick did. And mostly, though, I wanted to write like this guy wrote. I mean, it's the first time I'd read a book where the prose kind of went through my skin. And I mean, we've all had that experience. When you read writing that you just adore and it just kind of goes straight through your skin, straight to your heart. That's what it felt like. And it's like, I want to do that. So I had that idea, and I grew up doing everything I could to, that I could think of to try and be a good fiction writer. And, I heard Jack London put words he didn't know up on the wall, with note cards, and I did that, and I did all sorts of stuff. I got out of college, as an English major, and I had to make a living, and so I started writing for magazines because I was an extreme kayaker, and there was a niche for that. It's like, I was also expendable for these magazines. I wasn't like in their stable of favorite writers, so they sent me on these crazy trips. It's like, oh, well, if he comes back with a story, that'd be great. But I got diverted, and I ended up writing lots and lots of journalism, adventure journalism, expeditions, a lot of environmental stories, and I always knew the ending of those stories because they happened, and I always knew what was going to happen next. So when I finally got to sit down and write a novel, my first novel, I thought, I don't want to know. I want to be as surprised as the reader. I want to have fun writing this and be thrilled and shocked and, heartbroken. And so I thought, I'm not going to plot or anything like that. And also, since I was a paddler and a river runner, what I love about rivers is that if you put on a river that you don't know and you've never been on, or no one has, you come around a tight bend and you don't know what's going to be there. It could be like a cougar drinking, or a flight of swallows backlit, or a waterfall. And I wanted that thrill in writing fiction. So with the river, I started with the first line. They'd been smelling smoke for 2 days. And, and then there were these two guys, and they were up in a canoe, up on this lake that floated into a river. What happens when you write with this method is that very soon you bump into what you're really concerned about, what you're thinking about, or what's on your heart. And what I bumped into with the river within a few pages was something that happened to me when I was 17. When I was 17, I was in love for the first time. I was going to a school in southern Vermont. I have a lot of family in Vermont, and I was going to high school there. And my girlfriend was from New Hampshire, across the river, and her mom had a house on the edge of the White Mountains, and we would go there on the weekends. And it was a little cedar shingled farmhouse, and there was a meadow and horses, and there was a lake down below and this rock top mountain. I thought it was like paradise. And Margaret had 3 older sisters, all I thought were attractive, and a single mom who was also attractive. And so on the weekend, all the suitors would come out of the hills like a fairy tale. And they would descend on this little house, and they'd have these giant parties, these dinners, and everyone was broke, everyone was like a student or a musician or just working their way through whatever. And we would have, spaghetti dinners and cheap beer. And I just thought this was the best thing on earth. And one night, it was an October night. I remember it was like a clear, beautiful White Mountain night. And I remember the house was bursting at the seams, and there was a guy leaning against the wall, and he was very sad. He was late 20s, maybe mid 20s. And he was real charismatic. I could tell he was kind of handsome and charismatic, and everyone was treating him kind of gingerly. And he was one of those, sad, charismatic guys. And someone said, "Hey, Pete, he makes his living in a canoe. He's a geochemist, and he does studies way up in the middle of nowhere in a canoe, and you ought to go talk to him." And my ears swiveled, because that's what I wanted to do. I went over, I clicked a beer bottle because I thought that's what you're supposed to do. I'm 17, and I said, "Hey, what's up? You look kind of rough." And he said, "Well, I lost my wife 2 months ago." I was flabbergasted, and I said, "Well, what happened?" And he said, "Well, we were doing a study up in Labrador, really remote river. We were in a canoe, we were camping, and we were at the breakfast fire. She went over the berm to go relieve herself, and I never saw her again." And I said, "Was it a bear attack?" And he goes, no bear sign, no sign of." I said, "Well, did you look for her?" He said, oh yeah. I mean, I searched for a couple of days. And I walked away from that conversation, and I knew he was lying. All my antennae were humming, and I was only 17, but sometimes when you're like dead certain. And I thought, that son of a bitch killed his wife, and I just knew it. And I must have been thinking about it for 40 years, because as I was writing, the river, that's the story I bumped into. So that's one origin story. The other is that I had an assignment to do this river up in Canada, in Ontario, that runs a couple 100 miles into Hudson Bay, to go canoe it. And I was on the 3rd date with someone I thought was pretty neat, and she wanted to drop her gym bag off at my house before we went to dinner. So I picked it up, and it was really heavy. And I said, "Hey, what's in here?" And she said, "Weaponry." And I said, "Can I see?" And she goes, "Yeah, sure." So I unzipped it, and inside were short swords and throwing stars and sharpened chopsticks. I was like, "Whoa." I said, "I better be on my best. This woman's lethal. I got to be on my best behavior." But she was and she said she'd never really been camping or in a canoe, but I thought she was so tough that she could protect me, from bears or whatever. And so I invited her on this assignment. So we're loading up the canoe, and I have these blue plastic barrels, just like the guys do in the river. And it's called the Winnisk, and it is the Musqueam River. It's as written. And we're loading up, and she said, "Can I bring my eyebrow tweezers?" And I was in like such shock, like no one had ever asked me that before. And you got to cut me a little slack, just because I was in shock. And I said, "No." But I should have been more gracious, because how much did they weigh? Like a gram, right? Anyway, she got me back, because turns out she loves fossils. And as we're going down this river, which is the Musqueam, she started loading up the canoe with these chunks of limestone with fossils. And we got lower and lower in the water, and we started to lose our freeboard, and we're running whitewater. And one morning, I go to the canoe, and there's a 12-pound rock with a tiny little clamshell in one corner of it, fossil. And I picked it up, and I said, "Kim, do you think maybe?" And she's like, "Don't minimize me." And that's when I knew she was someone to ride the river with, because she was, you know what you need. And so now we're married. But anyway, that river served as the model for this one.
That's awesome. I love it. Eyebrow tweezers. Well, you talked a little bit about kind of your transition from a nonfiction journalism to writing fiction. Can you share a little bit more about what that transition was like for you?
Sure. As I said, I got out of school and I was like, I did every job, and when you're a writer, you don't mind. I lived in the back of my pickup in a topper for, a couple of years. I was a kayak instructor and I did construction, I cut wood, all sorts of jobs. And, when you're a writer, well, when you're that age, you don't mind it anyway. It's just fun. It's fun to go, to different towns, meet other people. And just, I love working outdoors. That's what I love to do. But it was one August, a friend of mine said, look, I'm living in Boulder, and I love to paddle, and there was a lot of rivers in Colorado. He said, why don't you, I've got a room in my house, it's cheap, why don't you come and you can write and get a job? So I wanted to kayak during the day when I wasn't writing, and so I got a job as a pizza deliverer at night, and I was like hell on wheels. Like I was the world-class pizza deliverer because stop signs meant nothing. And I have had fun. But one day a friend said, look, why don't you combine your interests? You're writing short stories in your room and you're paddling all this crazy stuff. Why don't you write for Outside Magazine? And, that was sort of the outdoor magazine. There was like Field and Stream for hunting and fishing. And then there was Outside for, kayaking and climbing. And when you're young and dumb, you don't know what you can't do. So I went down to the magazine store. I got a magazine. I looked up an editor whose name sounded nice. I called the 800 number for Outside, and I said, Laura Hano, please. And they said, just a minute. And I was like, ooh, Laura here. I was like, oh, crap. And I started talking really fast. And I said, hey, I'm a writer in Colorado. I kayak class 1. I just had a short story in Harper's, which was sort of true. It was just this little tiny reprint of a college story, really, really short story, but it was in there. And I said, I think you guys should send me to the Tibetan Plateau to do this river that's never been done. And there was this incredulous silence. And she finally said, I'm going to take a chance on you and I'm going to send you and I'm going to pay half your expenses. And if you write a good story, I'll pay the other half and I'll buy the story. And I was so excited. My paddle was all duct taped together so I could get a new paddle. And I went. And I won't tell the whole story, but on the training day, the first day on the river, a raft flipped, and I was one of a couple of kayakers. Came around a corner, I saw the raft just doing this empty in a hydraulic. And I saw a helmet in the water and big waves, and I paddled up to it and threw my stern around, and the wave crashed. You couldn't get it, and we were both getting pushed. It was flooded. The river was rising. It was raining really hard up in the Himalayas. You could see this big storm. And we were getting pushed towards this big log jam, and I hit the shore somehow in a little eddy about this wide, and he went into this V of logs, like a funnel, and his helmet joined another helmet that was already stuck there. And I ran out over the logs. I grabbed his life jacket, and the other kayaker was right there behind me. We pulled him off, pulled him to shore. He was still alive, thank God. He was one of the Chinese guys, and we went back for the other guy, and we started tugging and pulling, and he was stuck. And we put a Z-drag on him, which is a pulley system, and couldn't move him. And then we just held his head, and the river was rising, and it rose over his head. And he died in our arms. And he was on his honeymoon, and we had to paddle across the river and tell his new bride that he was gone. And it was, 2 days later, she took his ashes back the nehad day. They did it really fast. And 2 days later, we all gathered by the river, and it had quieted. The flood had receded. It was just a nice rhythmic whitewater river again. And I had a book of poetry, of Tang Dynasty Chinese poetry. I thought on my first assignment, because I loved poetry so much, that I would bring a book of these poems to sort of get the heart of the place. And I've done it ever since. And I read a poem from that book. And these are poems written in like 780 AD, over 1,000 years ago. And I read one. And then we spent a couple of weeks just driving around the Tibetan grasslands, in shock. And that was my first assignment, and I ended up writing the story, and it was a weird way to break into journalism. But you know, I thought if I don't take another story right away and paddle something hard, I probably never will again. It's kind of that get back in the saddle sort of thing. And so I got another assignment to join a Kiwi New Zealand Russian expedition to the Pamirs to do this river that was supposed to be the Everest of rivers in the Soviet Union. The last team that had tried it lost 5 of their 11 guys, and it was never been done successfully. And so Roy Bailey was a Kiwi kayaker and I were the kayakers, and the Russians had these big rafts, just one giant raft called a float. And Russians and Kiwis, it was really interesting, are like oil and water. They just, you'd get to a big, you know, Roy and I would kind of paddle out ahead, and when we got to a gorge or something with a big rapid, we'd signal everybody to get out, and the Russians would squat at the edge of the gorge, and they'd look down and they'd start chain smoking, and they'd get really grim. And it was like the weight of history, you know, like Tolstoy. And the Kiwis would be hopping around the bank going, oh, she'll be right, no worries, I see a line, you know. And it was like oil and water. And the guy that had to navigate the two teams between them was the translator, Vanya, and he learned all his English from Frank Zappa records. So he could sing every Frank Zappa song. And he was a riot. And one night in camp, he goes, Pete, last year I was guiding geology expedition in same region, and in next drainage over was international team of scientists led by French guy looking for Yeti. So one night, Pete, I took deck from plywood deck for raft deck, and I took saw from Swiss Army saw, and I cut out foot, and I put the handle on the foot. And you know, like snowbank, you got creek with moraine rock, and then snowbank, well, I walk along and I make tracks. He said, next day, Pete, they discovered the tracks. It made international headlines. But only one problem, Pete, was all left feet. So anyway, you can look it up. It actually did make headlines. So that was the beginning of the career of, you know, a long career in nonfiction, and I loved it. I mean, I got to meet really interesting people, committed people. I got to see people under pressure, which is always very interesting. And it was wonderful. But always in my heart was this idea: I wanted to write a novel. And you know, a few years ago, I thought, I think I have 9 months where I can not take a story. And I just sat down, and I went to my coffee shop, and I just sat down and I wrote, I keep the beast running. I keep the 100 low lead on tap. That's aviation fuel. I foresee attacks. A few lines later, my name is Hig, one name. Big Hig if you need another. If I ever woke up crying in the middle of a dream, and I'm not saying I did, it's because the trout are gone, every one. And as soon as he said that, I was like, all right, I'm listening. Speak. And then it was like this guy was on the other side of a campfire on an October night with like the wind blowing the flames around, and he was telling me what happened to him a few years ago. And it was the most thrilling thing. I would just sit down in the coffee shop and I would just tell myself, don't think, just listen. And Hig would start speaking. And I wrote like in a white heat for 7 months. I write 1,000 words a day. I always stop in the middle of something. I go past 1,000 times. I'm in the middle of a scene, so I can't wait to get up again in the morning. And I wrote for 7 months straight. And here's the crazy thing about writing fiction. I got to the last page, and Hig is lying under the stars, and he's thinking about his dog, and he's making up constellations because he doesn't quite remember all the constellations, so he makes them up. And he makes one for his fish-eating dog, and then he says, and my favorite poem was written by Li Shangyin in the 9th century. It's called When Will I Be Home? And it was the poem I had read for David 25 years before. I didn't even know that I knew it. And it goes, when will I be home? I don't know. In the mountains. Let's see, hold on. Ooh. When will I, in the mountains, in the rainy night, the autumn lake is flooded. One day, we will be back together again. We will sit in the candlelight by the west window, and I will tell you how I remembered you tonight on the stormy mountain. That was the last line of my first novel. And that's the cool thing about fiction to me, is that it's this vessel for all the stuff that you've ever experienced and you don't even know that you knew or that you remembered. It just kind of flies in from the universe, and it's wonderful. So anyway, yeah, that's the short answer.
That's fascinating. What experiences. Speaking of the dog stars, we're wondering if you've had questions about that during this time that we're in, just what your thoughts are on.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is weird. I mean, so for people who don't know it, the Dog Stars is about two guys who live at a little country airport north of Denver, about, 8 miles off the mountain front. And it's 9 years after super flu has killed almost everybody, 99.7% of people. And Hig, our hero, has lost his wife. She was pregnant with their first child. And he's got his old dog Jasper, an old blue heeler mix, and an old Cessna, 56 Cessna 182. And the two of them get in the plane every day and they fly a patrol looking for survivors. And the other guy at the airport is like a mean gun nut named Bangley. And he's, we all have friends that can't wait for the apocalypse. And this is Bangley. And they have this uneasy friendship. And they have this survival way, they're a good team in terms of survival. And that's how it starts. And so the night Denver went into lockdown, the governor said, this was in mid to late March. The governor said, you can go outside for exercise once this goes into place, but, aside from that. So I went down to a canyon south of Denver. It's about 40 minutes south of my house, and it was closed. They'd closed it. It's a dirt road that goes up a canyon. You can bike up it, and then I was going to fish. And I was like, dang, I really want to fish. So there's a state park, and this canyon comes out of the mountain front and onto the plains. And there's a state park right there, right below. And the river flows into the state park. And I thought, I'd never fished that section. I thought, I'll just go fish that now. I went through the gate, and there was no ranger at the gate, which was the first time. I mean, I'd been to that park before to do other stuff, and there was no ranger there. It was really eerie. And I drove through, and there were no cars. And I parked, and there was just a couple of trucks, and I went to the river, and there was like one or two fly fishermen. Everyone was kind of wary, and we waved, and I said, are you catching any trout? No, they said the suckers are running. And in the Dog Stars, the trout are gone, but he fly fishes for suckers and carp just to kind of pretend and stay connected to something that he loves to do. And so I started fishing, and the suckers were big. Suckers were running by me, and I was trying for trout, and I finally did catch a trout, but the whole thing was so eerie. I got goosebumps, and it was almost like life was imitating art. It was the weirdest thing. And then I drove home at dark, and I drove up Wadsworth, which is this big boulevard on the west side of Denver, and all the businesses were shuttered completely, and the road was empty. And I just got this, I got the hair stood up on the back of my neck because it was so much like this novel that I had written, and it was weird.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a little crazy. Okay. So we're going to transition over to our attendee questions.
Great.
So remember, you can type your questions in by clicking the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. How are you doing during this unusual time? Are you reading still? What has this time been like for you and your family?
For writers, it's not that much different. I mean, we're an odd breed. We spend so much time by ourselves, that it's not a whole lot different for me. I mean, I get up in the morning, I have my coffee. I do go and get a takeout, something strong like an espresso drink because I'm used to it. Because I always wrote in coffee shops, and I'd always drink a couple of cups of coffee at home, and then I'd go to a coffee shop and get like a latte with something strong in it that would last through the day. And So I get a takeout, I come back, and I just work. And then I try and, get some exercise in the evening. And, there's around Denver, there's great places to bike. You can paddleboard. And one thing that's really cool is doing a lot of kayaking as the rivers, the snow melt ran off. And I've been, connecting with old kayaking friends and running rivers. And the way we do it is when we have to run shuttle, I've got to pick up with an open bed, and I'm usually the shuttle vehicle. So everybody just gets in the back of the truck with masks on. It's open air and it's safe, and so we have a lot of fun, outdoors. But, and fishing is, safe. And so it's all right. My wife works at a museum as an actor, but that's closed. But she's an introvert, so she actually loves lockdown, or stay safe at home or whatever. She wishes it would go on forever. So anyway, it's not so bad. And yes, reading is I'm doing more reading now than I have in a long time. It's all right. Yeah, I have to say, given that I do feel for people who don't have those opportunities to get outside. I mean, there are people in cities who have been cloistered, and I don't know how they do it. They must be going crazy.
No, we're so thankful too to be in such beautiful country and be able to get outside in our region as well.
Yeah.
Really valuable, I know, to everybody. Our next question is from Derek. He says, as an author who values the sacredness of wildness, danger, and human experience, what do you think of the removal of Chris McCandless's bus last month? And I'm not familiar with that. Are you?
So that was the bus in the book Into the Wild.
Yes.
And the kid, he wanted to go have this experience, and he died there. And I guess it's a tourist attract, I guess. And the problem with it is that people who are unprepared go try to visit this bus, in the wilderness. And one woman drowned in the river trying to cross it. And it became a danger, at least to the authorities thought it was. I don't know what to think about that. I mean, I would have left it there. I mean, I think people should be able to take whatever risks that they feel like they want to take. I don't think they should make their kids take risks and stuff like that. But I think if you're a consenting adult and you want to go do something dumb, I've done a lot of that. And so I don't know. I would have left it, but.
Our next question is, who or what has influenced your writing over the years?
So Hemingway was the first guy. And the thing about Hemingway is it's hard with Hemingway because his writing style is so infectious that if you read, I found that if I read him and then tried to write it, and every young writer who likes Hemingway has this experience, all your stories sound like Hemingway. So I had to stop reading him. And then I started reading. I thought, he writes in these really clipped, he's very succinct. And so then I thought, to get the antidote, I needed an antidote to Hemingway. So I started reading Faulkner, because Faulkner just piles, his sentences can go on for pages. He'll have 1,000 clauses, it seems like. And that was a good antidote. So that was a big influence. A lot of influence in poetry. I read a lot of poetry coming up, and I liked, some of the canon, like Yeats and T.S. Eliot. I really liked Emily Dickinson. I read Flannery O'Connor and Eudora Welty stories. I love both of them. And then, as I sort of grew into my own taste for reading, I found that I was reading a lot of foreign language writers. I loved certain Spanish language writers. I got interested in Marquez, and then in Mutis, who was a friend of his, who's a magnificent writer, Mutis. And then I started reading an Argentinian named Iras, and then a Barcelonian named Villamatas. I started reading all these Spanish. Then I was reading Murakami. He's a Japanese novelist whom I adore. But I have to say, I think one of my very favorite writers living or dead right now is Cormac McCarthy, and he's a huge
Mhm.
influence on me. All the Pretty Horses, and his books are really, really special to me. So anyway, those are a few of them. And I have to say, book people like Louis L'Amour. I mean, I read every Louis L'Amour book, Western, by the time I was like 16. And I love Westerns. And I think one thing I love about Westerns, and Cormac McCarthy really is a Western writer, what I love about them is that the landscape, the wild country, becomes the biggest character. All the drama is thrown up against this wild, big country that's bigger and more powerful than any of the characters. And I just love that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have a lot of Western readers in our library district. So I'd love to hear some more. Do you have other Western author recommendations for us?
Well, Zane Grey was, big. but a lot of movies, I mean, I don't just read, I love movies. And I got to say, The Good, Bad, and the Ugly, and, those early Clint Eastwood movies, Pale Rider. I mean, holy cow, those are incredible stories. Treasure of the Sierra Madre, I think, is one of my very favorite movies on the planet. So on and on.
Great. Okay, our next question is, when you are creating new characters, how much do you need to have someone from real life serve as inspiration?
It ends up being a lot. I mean, it's funny, because I start with the first line and don't plan it, I never know what's going to happen. But usually, especially after the Dog Stars, I think all my major characters are based on real people. When I wrote the Dog Stars, as I said, I finished it in 7 months. I sent it in. I didn't expect it. I didn't have much expectation, but I love the book myself. It sold, in like a week, and they decided they were going to publish it in 9 months, which is fast. And I thought, I'd heard of second novel syndrome, and the pressure that can put on a writer. If his first book creates a clamor, or her first book, and I thought I better get the next one written in the next 9 months, so I don't have that pressure, right? Because who knows? People may hate the book or they may love it, but whatever the response is, it's going to affect the next one. And so I started in on The Painter. I was writing along, and it's about a painter from Taos, New Mexico, who's kind of brawny fly fisherman. They call him Hemingway down at the river. He comes from this tough, kind of brawling, hard drinking school of painters in Taos that's real. And he basically sees a guy beating a horse to death, an outfitter, and he saves the horse and kills the guy. That's basically the beginning of the book. Doesn't spoil anything because it happens right at the beginning. And stuff happens after that. And he's a famous painter. So anyway, I started writing that. I was a few pages in, or maybe like a week in, and I started thinking, this Jim Stegner sounds a lot like Jim Wagner, my fishing buddy for 9 years in Western Colorado. And then I made a command decision that it wasn't him, because the liability issues would be too rough. So I thought, it's not him. I kept writing a few more weeks, and I was like, oh man, it really is him. So I called him up and I said, Jim, I am writing a book about an expressionist painter from Taos. He's like, oh, cool, that sounds great. Yeah, and he shot a guy in a bar just like you did, and for a guy making a comment about his kid, and he was a little high and to the left, just like you were, so he didn't murder him. And he spent a year in Santa Fe State, just like you did. He was pardoned by the governor for being a state treasurer, just like you, and he kind of looks like you, and he's kind of broad-shouldered. He wears his cap with the flies in it and paint spatter, and they call him Hemingway at the river, just like you. And I went on and on. I said, yeah, and his palette, it's just like yours. I mean, kind of and what he paints. And I actually put one of your paintings in the book the other day, the one with the fish swallowing the houses. And I finally got done. He goes, man, that sounds really cool. Send me the book when you're done. So I wrote the book. I got the first 2 copies in the mail. I sent him one. 4 days later, I get a phone call. I see it. I'm going on tour with the book. I'm in the plane, and I see Jim Wagner. I'm like, "Hi, Jim." He goes, "Oh, I read the book. I love the book." He said, "I'm walking around my house wondering if I killed a guy." And that was fun. But so that worked out based on a real character. Celine is about a crack investigator, private eye, who's an artist, who's older woman, elegant, and that's about my mom. And so, sort of every book after The Dog Stars is about a real person. And sometimes I don't change names because I love having people wonder, what's real and not.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of mischievous.
Yeah, I love it.
I'll tell a funny story quickly about that, because after I wrote Celine, Celine is my mom, and Hank is the son, and he lives on the west side of Denver on a lake, just like I do. He has my truck. He's a journalist just like me, and a closet poet, just like, okay. His wife is named Kim, just like mine. So, and in the book, Hank is telling his mom, "Oh, she left, but I think she'll come back, and I'm not drinking right now, and I think it'll be all right." So that's in the book. So I go to a party 2 weeks after the book's published, and all these people come up and they're like, "Are you and Kim all right?" And I'm like, "It's fiction. We're fine." And one friend even came up and asked for her number.
No.
So anyway, I like to mix it up, keep people wondering.
Keep us on our toes. That's awesome. Okay, I think this will be the last question. We get this question a lot. What is a behind the scenes tidbit from your life that would probably surprise your fans and readers the most?
Behind the scene tidbit. Well, when I got out of college, I drove to LA to try and be a screenwriter. And I hated LA. But on the way, I decided to stop and see the family of one of my best friends who had taught me to kayak. And his dad was the doctor, a mountain doctor way up in this little town. And I stopped in, and I was going to stay for 2 nights, and I ended up staying for 6 weeks. And adopted that family as my second family, or they adopted me, and shot my first elk on that trip, and just had the best time with these guys. And then I went to LA, and the only job I could get was with it was a lesbian-run ad agency in West Hollywood, and I ghost wrote articles by a lesbian registered nurse about women's health. So there you go.
Good tidbit. Love it.
You got to make a living.
That's fantastic. Okay. Peter, thank you so much.
Do you want me to close with the one little paragraph?
Yeah. I'm gonna share a couple things. Just for our attendees, we so appreciated your time. Thank you for joining us tonight. Remember that Peter's books are available digitally through our Hoopla and Overdrive services. Check them out at ncrl.org. And also remember our local bookstores during this time. Don't forget, we have a Rivers End bookstore in Winthrop. We have a Book for All Seasons in Chelan and Book for All Seasons in Leavenworth, and Riverwalk Books in Chelan. So check those out. Check their websites. I know they're eager to have all of us visit them. And this evening's program is a part of our NCRL Virtual Reads author series. Join us next Tuesday, July 14th at 4 p.m. to hear from Chanel Clayton. She is the best-selling author of Next Year in Havana, When We Left Cuba, and most recently, The Last Train to Key West. We hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you for joining us. And yes, Peter, would you mind closing us out with a reading?
Right. Hey, that author next month sounds awesome.
Yeah.
That's really fun. All right, so the fire becomes a bigger and bigger character in the book, in the river, and so Wynn is now sitting by his own campfire. He sat away from the fire, facing downstream, where the woods were still green and standing, and he worked a little chunk of wood in his hand with his knife. He heard a loon call, piercing and forlorn, and it poured into his spirit like cool water. It was a sad cry, and he realized as he listened how barren the river had felt in the days without it. Why was a whale that seemed so lost and lonely so, essential and lovely? It was like the blues he guessed, or like Jack's cowboy songs. Sad, but somehow you would starve without them. Hey, thanks a ton for having me. It was really fun, Amanda. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Peter. Have a great evening.
All right, see ya.
Bye, everyone.